I really liked Hereditary. And I totally respect it if you're the kind of person who didn't, because it is quite clearly, demonstrably even, a divisive film.
Moreover, I really like that this is the kind of movie that created a lot of interesting discussion and seemed to be really resonating with certain audiences, myself included. Others markedly less so, and I think that's fair enough. Not every type of movie is ideally suited for every type of audience, and A24 probably did make the wrong call in deciding to widen the release to a general horror thrill ride audience with a trailer that made it seem like it was going to be something big and loud, like one of the Conjuring movies or something. When in actual fact, Hereditary is a much quieter, more chilling, more cerebral work that requires great time and care to create its atmosphere. And I don't just mean in terms of the technical details of the way that the plot and structure are mapped out, the psychological mechanics of the way that the scares are designed, or the off-kilter use of sound and cinematography, but more specifically the ideas and themes it's playing with, which a general movie-going audience quite understandably wouldn't want to engage with for their weekend entertainment. Because make no mistake, what Hereditary is trying to get at is really thorny.
Hereditary is a story about the ways that families hurt you, whether they mean to or not. There's your second content warning, by the way. No one will think any lesser of you if you decide to back out now.
For those unaware, writer-director Ari Aster initially made a splash back in 2011 with his student film The Strange Thing About the Johnsons, a deeply unsettling and controversial short film exploring power dynamics within the family unit through a taboo subject for the explicit purpose of challenging the audience in a way that I'm just not going to spoil because it gets most of its power from the less you know going in. Much like Hereditary, part of the appeal of the film, and why it's up there with Too Many Cooks and Don't Hug Me I'm Scared in terms of surreal and disturbing internet phenomena, is its capacity to manage and toy with your expectations, indicative of a filmmaker who isn't merely competent but is actively focused on a desired result, which makes him the kind of ideal suit for the kind of project that Hereditary needs to be. There's a certain playful character to his shorts taken as a whole, where each does feel distinctly different from each other, though his themes seem to cluster around very similar ideas. What will become relevant later is his particular interest in the family unit, specifically taking safe, familiar authoritarian figures and showing them to be deeply flawed in a way that is existentially terrifying. Munchausen, for instance, explores the comedic implications of this, where a mother accidentally kills her own child out of the sadness that he will someday leave her forever.
This is one of the foundational appeals of horror storytelling. You're able to deal with abstract metaphor in a way that's just a bit more direct, and on top of that, you're able to really plunge down into the cerebellum of the human psyche and really jab at human fears and anxieties in a way that conventional cinema is just often unprepared to do. It's also the reason why horror tends to be a bit more folkloric in nature.
It's not often remarked upon in conventional cinema exactly how scary childhood and parenthood can be, how frightening it is to know that the parental figures in your life who exercise authority over your early life and you just take as a given are naturally caring and considerate are actually exuding conscious effort to be that way, and that it all could have gone wrong at any moment, which in turn makes it even more frightening when it sometimes does. Children can sometimes be terrified of their parents, and vice versa. We explored this idea a little bit back when we did We Need to Talk About Kevin, the notion of the paedophobic horror movie, which has its lineage in movies like The Village of the Damned, The Exorcist, The Omen, and Children of the Corn, a style born out of the specific socio-political time in which they were made, a time of the Vietnam War, the rise of political conservatives, and their hippie children angrily protesting in the streets.
That's not to suggest that those movies did indeed have an explicitly political bent. What I'm trying to suggest is that those movies somehow managed to capture the push-pull generational antagonism that was very much felt during that period.
In this context, Hereditary isn't unique, however it does represent something of a reprisal of similar ideas explored by previous generations with its own twist, in league with other recent horror fare. Films featuring children who are terrified of their parents and/or authority, sometimes abstracted as unknowable quantities far beyond the character's understanding, which is possibly in response to Well, what's of note here is that not only does Hereditary present us with the scary idea that our parents cannot or are often unprepared to thwart the things that go bump in the night, but that they very often are those things through carelessness, inattention, or indeed active malice, and the build and release of different tensions across the narrative is very much born out of that idea. This is what creates Hereditary's fascinating pathology. It's about a family that's suffering and in turn causes itself even more pain, and it takes the implications of that premise dead seriously, which results very strongly in a film that is equal parts haunting, melancholic, terrifying, and sad.
I just wanna die.
There's a good chance that you found this video whilst you were searching for additional content regarding all the little tidbits that are hidden in the background that hint towards the larger plot, and whilst it is tempting to get into all of that, I would instead like to keep this rather formal and talk about what it's aiming for thematically, what mechanics it's using to get there, and why it's ultimately in the shape that it's in. What it's all trying to mean, in other words.
The movie has kind of gone out of its way through certain cinematography choices, the opening and closing shots, and that poster that looks suspiciously similar to Cabin in the Woods to express that it's not necessarily a story about literal things literally happening. The opening shot gives us the dual implication that the movie is both framed as an art piece and that the characters are actively being toyed with by dark forces that mean to cause severe harm, like figurines in a doll's house. And once you accept this framework, it being purposefully built into the narrative, you're hopefully supposed to allow for certain gaps in realism later on, and larger ideas regarding the themes start to snap into place. Ideas regarding artifice and arranged circumstances, because of course dolls' houses are arranged by someone to look and feel a certain way, almost as much as the film you're watching has been deliberately arranged to have this be the opening shot of this story.
This is an idea that's core to the horror genre taken as a whole, where when things happen, they're usually to be taken metaphorically as an extension of what the characters are facing internally. I mean, sure, when screenwriters are feeling lazy, characters do supremely idiotic things in order to move the plot forward, but in Hereditary, everything is very strongly grounded in character psychology, and great care is taken to make sure that things check out in terms of like what a person might do.
For the sake of comparison, The Shining is a story about a family man whose inner demons get the best of him when he's tasked with maintaining a vast, lush but empty hotel for the winter, which may or may not actually be haunted, and doesn't have alcohol or his writing to distract or numb him from the pain of being alone with his own family and be reminded of the pain he'd previously caused them. The story does indeed utilise ghosts as part of the framework, but their narrative utility is ultimately to give weight to Jack's struggle, to impress upon him the temptations that he will slip into in order to create Act 3's tension. Because it's not really the ghosts that want to kill Wendy and Danny, it's Jack and his seething, barely controlled anger, of which the ghosts are, to an extent, a manifestation thereof. And in the end, after succumbing to his demons and being driven into a spiralling madness of his own making, he is swallowed by the hotel as another chapter of its morbid history. What matters here is the sense of doom and inevitability in Jack's downfall. He's always been here, because he and the hotel's bad blood are of the same. The toxic family dynamics in Hereditary create a similar sense of spiralling doom. Its characters are damned to tear themselves to pieces as they succumb to their own hideous internalization, leading them to die in the name of resurrecting an ancient demon at the hands of an incomprehensible cult of unknown origin. To watch Hereditary is to encounter entropy, a corroding force that its characters are unable to prevent or surpass. Coupled with the greater revelation about the cult and that they've been quietly manipulating the family as part of a ritual to summon said ancient demon, it creates the thematic idea that trauma can be an inherited malady that dissolves the lives of those it's inflicted upon.
This is essentially the idea that's at the heart of Hereditary, how we inherit the trauma that those before us have inflicted, and how failing to understand that trauma, failing to truly reckon with it, results in said trauma becoming worse.
This is best expressed through our two principal characters, Peter and Annie, whose character arcs bear certain similarities. I say principal characters because even though it is an ensemble cast, it's Peter and Annie's eyes through which we most often experience the narrative. As a character, Peter is your typical slacker older brother. He's despondent, lazy, and apathetic, just coasting through school, nothing really needs his attention and would rather just turn off and smoke weed than confront what's around him. But his pain won't let him, no matter how much he tries to numb himself to it. His despondency, his need to get away and turn off in order to ignore his pain, is ultimately what dooms him, in turn causing harm through apathy. In what is easily one of the film's most horrifying scenes, Peter accidentally decapitates his little sister in a car accident, followed by a 2-minute shock pause in which Peter is unable to look in the rearview mirror and see exactly what's happened, a trauma caused directly by his own inattention.
This moment is a terrifying extension of his own attitude towards his family. He's trying as hard as he can to ignore them.
And thus he spends the rest of the film being tormented and traumatised by the lingering presence of the sister he failed to acknowledge, as well as by Annie's scorn that Peter did such an unspeakable thing and caused her such insurmountable pain and suffering as a result.
And I know you miss her, and I know it was an accident, and I know you're in pain, and I wish I could take that away for you. I wish I could shield you from the knowledge that you did what you did, but your sister is dead! She's gone forever!
Annie similarly tries to distract herself with her work, trying to contextualise her problems and trauma through her art. From this vantage point, she's able to have some kind of abstract view on her pain, even whilst the details are recreated hyper-realistically, all the while she lives in the aftermath of a relationship with her own mother, which she is quite literally unable to unpack. As things take a turn and Annie is brought into further pain by Charlie's death at the hands of Peter, she sinks into a depression and vulnerability and becomes even more distant from the family, instead wanting to just be away from the house, leading her to be driven to the emotional support of a suspiciously convenient maternal figure who manipulates her feelings, not unlike her own mother, all the whilst having recurring nightmares about hurting her family in ways that she had previously caused them, and ways that she hadn't admitted she felt.
I never wanted to be your mother.
Why?
I was scared. I didn't feel like a mother. But she pressured me.
Her darkest fears and thoughts are revealed to her in her dreams, which in turn fuels her vulnerability and causes her to act erratically and cause more harm to the rest of the family. And it's only until Annie unpacks that box that she realises what kind of lifestyle her mother led, and it's only then that she discovers her mother's body in the attic, like a giant rotting symbol of how her trauma, her vulnerability, and her grief still hasn't properly been dealt with. But by then, it's already too late. She then attempts to sacrifice herself for the health and stability of her family, only for Stephen to be set aflame by Charlie's burning book, an outward manifestation of Annie's worst nightmares come to life.
I just don't want to put any more stress on my family.
And it's at this moment that Annie fully collapses and becomes possessed by the spirits that haunt her. Much like Jack Torrance in the Overlook Hotel, Annie gets swallowed by her trauma because her and it are from the same place, her mother's influence having finally taken its toll, physically and emotionally. Over the course of the film, she is gradually destroyed by her pain until she is fully consumed into it, becoming a symbol of fear and abuse to Peter, as her mother had been to her, even succumbing to a similar fate by ritualistically removing her own head. The cycle of trauma and manipulation that haunts the family comes to a climax, with Peter only left standing to be hunted from the shadows by Annie and eventually overtaken by Payman. What's particularly of note is the way in which the characters are suffering with their own guilt, trauma, mental health, and how their inability to confront it directly, to look at what is causing their own pain and why it leads to said pain manifesting outwardly and causing harm to others. How things get worse the longer they go unnoticed because the characters are trying to ignore them.
And with that in mind, consider also the chilling logic of placing some of the film's scariest ideas just in the corners of the frame, shrouded in heavy shadow, only to be noticed by the audience when it's already too late.
Alongside all this is the way in which the movie is able to manage and subvert your expectations. You thought it was this and now it's this, but it's actually this, as if the movie itself is some kind of ominous force that enjoys messing with you, not unlike The Overlook Hotel or Silent Hill.
On that subject, it's also worth pointing out that the movie has got a very deliberate and cruel sense of humour, like in a very postmodern sense.
Like, the movie has very carefully presented these characters and their suffering authentically, in portraying their struggle as terrifyingly real, and we feel the weight of the emotional and human damage that this is causing. But internally, it's also taunting them with ideas like this overblown shot of someone chopping a huge pile of nuts at the party, or dropping in Joan, who's straight out of Rosemary's Baby, to act suspiciously whilst Annie has no clue, and that scene where the teacher literally explains a story about characters who don't pay attention to what's going on.
So does that make it more tragic or less tragic than if he has a choice?
Accumulatively, it creates a mood of ominous cruelty that hovers over the air like a spectre, as you can never be too sure where the movie is going, but you can be certain that it's going to go somewhere bad for everyone. This sense of cruelty is often utilised mechanically through red herrings and technical suspense, meaning that we're told and shown things well in advance of the characters learning them, and thus we're encouraged to feel a more pertinent sense of tragedy when the characters fail to realise what's about to happen. At the same time, it's also nudging you, going, hey, you thought this was a spooky child movie, so we're just going to kill her off in 30 minutes? Hey, this character's been part of a satanic cult that's manipulating the family, but that's not going to be relevant for another hour. Oh man, the look that's going to be on her face when she realises that it's already too late.
Now, you may find that kind of storytelling annoying, as Mark Kermode did, but for me, it's more or less able to get away with it because, like I said, this is an accumulative effect that adds to the larger whole.
The way the movie is constructed, it creates this sense of mocking futility to the character's suffering for the purpose of expressing the feeling that depression and loneliness can bring upon a person. The sense of hurt, the cruelty and vulnerability felt in the mind of a depressive comes from an existential pain of feeling like the butt of a great cosmic joke, and ultimately the reason why it's able to kill off the spooky child character when you thought it was going to be a spooky child movie, and why it presents this character made out of red flags well before Annie realises as such, is because it's not about either of those things any more than The Shining was about a spooky hotel. It's about a family that hurts itself because it's unable to process the hurt coming at it. Hereditary isn't really about ghosts or demons or weird naked cults who are trying to resurrect a deity for worship. It's about a family collapsing under the weight of its own collective trauma, where the cult and the demonic possession are meant as the signal that marks that climax. The cult and its broader revelations are meant as, or at least an attempt at, a culmination of the story's themes. Long before the story starts, there's already a plan put in motion by Ellen which effectively dooms the characters, of which the cult are tasked with putting into motion. Now, obviously, the plan itself is so insane and vast that it would just be impossible to actually pull off with the right timing and cooperation, but it doesn't really matter ultimately because its purpose is to bear the weight of the themes, the spectre of history, of bad blood, of hereditary trauma and damage bearing down upon a family that's been broken apart by grief and negligent to each other's suffering. The characters are all suffering in their own individual way, but moreover, they all have their own complicated relationship with the deceased and with each other in a way that's just hard for them to pass, which is what makes them turn away from each other in pain.
I'll be right back.
No, you won't. You're taking the blanket.
This is what creates the familiar sense of being haunted in the film. It's bad enough that a human life has been taken away and that you now have to be reminded that their presence isn't there anymore, but the trauma they may have caused doesn't go away. It still lingers in the mind as you try and unpack and reconcile with the idea that sometimes we will be deeply hurt by the ones we love and that love us. The fatal flaw that becomes of all the characters' downfall is that they're unable to come together and talk through their problems directly. The tension being between having to be reminded of the shared pain in togetherness or to try and anaesthetise yourself to what's happening in the hopes that you can ignore your own suffering. On the technical end, there's a coldness to the cinematography that helps aid this sense of distance, that the characters would rather be on their own than be reminded that there's someone missing from the house. This aspect of their behaviour is deeply true of depression and sadness, the way that it grinds you down and makes you only want to just be alone with your feelings. But even that won't protect them from the spectre that haunts them. It's one of the parts of this film that I find is a kind of lesson to be learned. Whilst the film is an explicit tragedy, the big takeaway is that we simply can't be alone during times of great sadness. Even if it pains us to be together, we simply need to come together and help ourselves and each other. Traumatic experiences, and mental health in particular, can often feel like curses in a way. They are ultimately copable, but they will often leave you in moments of great helplessness or in some way a victim to some greater force. This is what I think the introduction of the cult does. On a thematic level, it creates this layer of victimhood, of deliberate persecution that the characters are unable to overcome or understand. It's also why the cult's plan doesn't exactly hang together logically from an outside point of view, but internally, from the eye of the storm, the notion that you are being deliberately punished for some reason fits with a depressive mindset.
Speaking anecdotally, grief kind of does make people lose their minds just a little bit because your world is shaken up in a way that is just irreparable through no fault of your own, and the sadness that enables comes from this place of incomprehension.
As someone who's experienced grief in my life twice, I can attest to this. Grief has given me this profound sense of psychological alienation, the sense that a person's life, irrespective of whether or not they have positivity or negativity attached to them, has been stolen and now only exists as a half memory. There's no way that you can truly lock what's left of that person inside your head, and so you just have to learn to accept that they have and will continue to expire. And that acceptance doesn't get any less painful whilst you acknowledge it. And you have to learn to be careful because there's a depth to that pain that has a swallowing quality to it, which is why it just makes so much sense that some people deliberately go out of their way to ignore it.
And now you're probably starting to see why I took my time to make this.
So, speaking of the cult earlier, one of the movie's primary arms of attack is manipulation, which is an idea that impresses upon just about every aspect of the production, but most prominently the themes, seeing as it's a big part of the character's world and the context of how they suffer. Annie's mother, Ellen, is often referred to as being a manipulative and closed-off person, which ends up being even more terrifying because it's her actions that have doomed the characters before the story even starts. And by her hands, her husband, her son, and Annie suffered psychologically while she was alive, which informs a lot of Annie's mindset going forward in her life. Annie also describes this feeling of persecution, a sense of blame for how her children have turned out and are hurting, which is really just an extension of the internal suffering she felt under her mother's judgment, because, as I said before, this kind of mindset doesn't disappear along with the person who caused it. There's no magical undo trauma button that can turn off self-destructive patterns. They just need to be actively worked on. What stops her from working on her pain is her support group friend Joan, who turns out to be a member of Ellen's cult, who preys upon her vulnerability and convinces her to perform a seance that ends up making Peter's suffering and guilt even worse. So much so that in his state of vulnerability, he's tortured, not unlike a marionette, by Payman's spirit during class.
It's worth highlighting that these moments of vulnerability and manipulation have a knock-on effect to the other characters, effectively driving a wedge between all of the family members and making their suffering even more devastating.
When you put this together with the death of a loved one, the sense that the characters are haunted becomes clear, both diegetically and metaphorically. It feels not merely that they are grieving, but the accumulative weight of their family history is bearing down on them and forces them to buckle. This somewhat ties into the idea of the cult, who are essentially the facilitators of their doom at the hands of the departed who put all this into motion in the first place. We are haunted by our families, through history, through bad actions, and through blood. Well before any of the bad events take place, Annie discovers a note from her mother that tells her to not despair about her losses, which will pale in comparison to the rewards, creating this idea that the cult is a kind of predetermined safety measure after her death. Like, she's decided for the rest of the family that being indoctrinated into this cult and claiming one of their bodies as their host for their demon god is what's best, and that's final. Annie's character journey is one of the primary reasons why the movie stuck with me, because there's just such an incredibly weighty sense of tragedy to her suffering. She already has a bevy of psychological hang-ups which she's trying to cope with through her art, and she's poked and prodded by her surroundings, whether that be her antagonism with Peter, her distant husband, her negligence of Charlie, the trauma and memory of her mother, or the fake loving support of Joan, into causing irreparable damage to her own family. The bad seeds were already planted by her relationship with her mother, and so she's primed and ready to be a destructive force when the right buttons are pushed by Joan. All the while, she's trying as hard as she can to not hurt anyone in her life, even whilst she has caused harm to her family in the past through her various hang-ups. And right before she fully self-destructs, the most consistently stable person in her life is burned alive, not unlike how she'd previously hurt Peter, both in her memory and in her most unguarded moments.
Why did you try to kill me?
I did! I was trying to save you!
Why did you try to kill me?
Another thing that's worth remarking upon is how the movie points out how unbelievably cruel people can act in the name of their own self-care. Around the middle act of the film, there's a scene where Annie is making a diorama of Peter's car accident. Again, a way for her to deal with her pain in a controlled environment, but she has little to no consideration of how Peter will feel if it's included in the exhibition.
How do you think he's going to feel when he sees that?
What? It's not about him.
Oh, no?
No, it's a neutral view of the accident.
You know, because it's totally possible to have a neutral view of the death of your child.
This also ties into one way that you can look at the seance scene and its ramifications, how Annie's need for closure and psychological comfort, the need to know that Charlie is in a better place or is alive in spirit in some form, makes things worse. This is essentially a thematic reflection on the note that Ellen left Annie at the start. She's decided what's best for everyone and has doomed them. And even more curiously, this scene is placed just after Annie's nightmare, in which she subconsciously recreates a moment where she hurt Peter, only to lead into another scene where she conjures the spirit of a dead character and hurts Peter. Whether she means to or not, Peter is effectively punished by Annie because of the pain that he had caused her, directly causing an active decay in Peter's mental well-being, as well as her own.
This sense of mental decay and manipulation is often utilised by the movie itself through psychological mechanics. Like, a common trick that the movie will pull is that it will start a scene and will have the tension build higher and higher and higher and higher and higher and higher, and then it will just cut the sound and leave you and the characters alternately terrified and alone and in danger in the atmosphere that it's created out of nothing. In a very direct way, the movie is essentially fucking with you across its runtime and will often leave you feeling terrified and helpless at its mercy, as prey to its form and mechanics.
And then when things finally come to a crescendo, where Peter is chased into the attic where Ellen's body had previously been placed, the flies still buzz around the scenery as if to symbolise the culmination of the family's decay, only to witness his mother completely self-destruct and become surrounded by the cult. Swarmed by the weight bearing down and closing in on him, Peter kills himself trying to escape from the window, and his body is overtaken by Payman, thus completing the ritual. And then there's that final shot, which mirrors the opening shot in that they both look like one of Annie's dioramas, cementing the idea of a manipulated, organised effort towards a desired result. This is also because Hereditary itself is a manipulated, organised effort towards a desired result. We have a habit of thinking of stories as neutral entities that either affect us or don't in very values-neutral ways, but Hereditary refuses, through its construction to themes to denouement, to be misplaced in such terms. Hereditary is a story that happens to you. Whilst the film presents such a strong sense of inevitability with its character's downfall, I think the reason why the film is so terrifying and why it seems to have really resonated with its audience, as it has with me, is that its character's downfall is a deeply human failing. They don't fall apart because of a magical book of spells that someone reads out loud or because of some mad guy with an axe, though the movie does wrongfoot you by making you guess things like that are happening. Instead, its characters are in pain, and they make their pain worse by failing to come together.
So does that make it more tragic or less tragic that if he has a choice?
They are ultimately their own undoing, unable to maneuver or work through their pain, and thus become indoctrinated into it. You may not agree with Asta's fatalistic framework, that we are all essentially doomed to inherit the trauma of our deeply flawed forebearers, but it is a framework that is compelling to a depressive mindset because it speaks to certain attitudes and emotions that are felt authentically, even if the ideas that motivate those feelings are not true.
Our childhoods were decided for us. Our parents did what they felt was best with the tools and ideas they happened to have, and sometimes those aren't good things at all. Very often the things they did were influenced by experiences they had with their own parents and their own parents before them. And if those experiences were bad, then the pain they felt doesn't disappear easily and can come back and shape us in ways you just can't quite predict. These things shape us whether we want them to or not. And sometimes these things can barrel forward and shape others even when you're trying to do the right thing. Being able to pull apart and understand that pain is what it takes to truly reckon with it, and that process itself can be really scary. And even then, you can never truly escape the pain that you've lived through. You do become cursed to live with it, but it is ultimately copable with communication and vulnerability with people who love you. This is the crux of why Hereditary hit home for me, the cruelty that we can inflict on each other and ourselves in the name of reparation for our own pain. It is a film about how even you can be prey to your own family's expectations, stated or otherwise. It's a film about how cruelly we can act, even to our own family, when we are hurting, and how sometimes the source of that hurt can be a long, travelling inheritance.
I'd like to leave you with a quote now. It's actually one of my favourite quotes from Alan Moore's miniseries From Hell. The one place that gods inarguably exist is in our minds, where they are real beyond refute in all their grandeur and monstrosity. I strongly believe that to be true, in more ways than one really appreciates. If one has had experience with mental health problems or familial difficulties, or even the death of a loved one, it is perfectly possible to feel as if life has cast you as the victim in some great possession ritual or curse. And whilst it's important to remember that such demons only exist in our minds, which they do, it doesn't make those moments any less terrifying. Ari Aster's film has set out to drag its audience kicking and screaming through its own psychological hang-ups for the purposes of confrontation and healing, acting as both patient and therapist, and perhaps also butcher. And much like trauma, the film is really difficult to move past or pass out. But by experiencing it and understanding it, it is effectively a safe space for us to practice intense interpersonal feelings and work through our maladies wherever they may manifest. It's a journey that is terrifying and is tinged with a certain melancholy, but it's a deeply valuable one if you're willing to take the ride.